In June 2008, a Texan with no banking degree landed a helicopter on the most sacred cricket ground in the world. He stepped out carrying a plexiglass case with $20 million in cash. England's players sat in his lap for the photos. 8 months later, every dollar of that money had been stolen from retirees' life savings. And the man handing it out was running the second largest investment fraud in American history. This is Allen Stanford, and this is the bank that never existed. Allen Stanford grew up in a small town in Texas. He opened a bodybuilding gym. It failed. He tried real estate. That nearly broke him too. By every measure, he looked like a guy who just couldn't catch a break. So he went to the Caribbean. He landed in Antigua in the late 1980s and founded a small offshore bank. Offshore banking is completely legal. Multinational companies use it all the time. Nothing suspicious about the sign on the door. What he was selling also made sense on paper. Certificates of deposit. Think of them like a fixed savings account. You lock in your money, you get a guaranteed return at the end. Safe. Boring. The kind of thing your grandmother keeps at a local bank. Except Stanford's version had one difference that made investors forget all common sense. While American banks were paying 3 or 4% a year, Stanford was promising 11–12% every single year, no matter what happened in the markets. Dot-com crash, 12%. September 11th, 12%. His pitch was polished, a proprietary global investment strategy, managed by experts, details confidential, trade secrets, you understand. 30,000 investors across 113 countries believed him. Wealthy Latin American families, European professionals, American retirees. At its peak, Stanford Financial Group claimed to manage over $50 billion in assets. But he didn't just sell a product. He sold an identity. He bought newspapers in Antigua. He built a cricket stadium. He employed over 1,000 people on the island. The government knighted him. Sir Allen Stanford, the first American ever knighted by Antigua. He donated to politicians in Washington. He was photographed with heads of state. And then came that helicopter at Lord's Cricket Ground, the most famous cricket venue on earth. A handshake deal with England's cricket board, the richest match in the sport's history. 300 million television viewers heard his name. He looked like a statesman. 30,000 investors trusted him like one. Here's what was actually happening inside Stanford International Bank. Nothing. Of every dollar deposited, 85 to 90% never went near a legitimate investment. It went straight into Allen Stanford's personal accounts. 6 private jets, multiple yachts, mansions on 3 continents, the cricket tournaments, the helicopter stunts, all of it funded with other people's retirement savings. The financial statements showing consistent double-digit returns through recessions, through market crashes, through 15 years of global volatility, were, in the words of the Securities and Exchange Commission, completely fictional. The mechanic is simple. Pay old investors with new investors' money. As long as more cash flows in than flows out, the math holds. The moment redemptions exceed deposits, the whole structure collapses. Bernie Madoff ran the exact same game. Stanford just did it offshore, in a country he had quietly taken over. Because Stanford had one layer of protection Madoff never managed. He owned the regulator. Antigua's financial oversight body was run by a man named Leroy King. And King was, quietly, on Stanford's payroll. Super Bowl tickets, private jet flights, and over $500,000 in cash. Every time American federal regulators sent inquiries to Antigua asking about Stanford's bank, King buried them. He even forwarded the regulators' confidential questions directly to Stanford so he could prepare his answers in advance. The American watchdog was being fed information curated by the man it was investigating. One more detail. An $8 billion bank needs a credible auditor to sign off on its books. Stanford's auditor was a 2-person accounting firm in Antigua that almost nobody had ever heard of. 2 employees. $8 billion. No one asked questions or a business that slowly went wrong. Stanford built this deliberately, over 2 decades, with precision. Every year the scheme survived convinced him he was smarter than everyone watching. The Securities and Exchange Commission first opened an inquiry into Stanford in 1997. not 2007. 1997, 12 years before the collapse, investigators noticed what any careful observer should have noticed. Returns too consistent, too high, for too long. A former Stanford executive had already told regulators the bank was presenting hypothetical projections as real historical performance. That's not a gray area. That's textbook fraud. But every inquiry died in Antigua. Leroy King killed them. And inside the SEC, the Stanford case kept getting shuffled between departments, never escalating the way it should have. A later internal review confirmed the agency had failed to pursue it properly for over a decade. Meanwhile, the flags were everywhere. Returns triple the market average with no verifiable explanation. A multi-billion-dollar bank audited by a firm nobody had heard of. An offshore regulator controlled by the man being regulated. A CEO whose lifestyle, 6 jets, a private stadium, a knighthood, dwarfed any plausible executive salary. Financial statements stamped proprietary with no breakdown of where the returns actually came from. Former employees raised concerns internally. A handful of independent analysts flagged the CD yields publicly. But Stanford had built a wall of credibility so thick, the media coverage, the cricket, the political connections, that skepticism felt almost rude. Then came September 2008. Lehman Brothers collapsed, markets went into freefall, and investors everywhere started pulling their money out of anything they couldn't immediately verify. Stanford's investors started calling. They wanted their money back. He couldn't pay, not because the markets had wiped out his portfolio, but because there was no portfolio. There had never been one. By February 2009, 4 agencies were investigating simultaneously: the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the Securities and Exchange Commission, the Internal Revenue Service, and Florida state regulators. On February 16th, agents raided Stanford's offices in Houston and 2 other cities. The following day, the SEC stated it publicly. Stanford International Bank's financial statements were fictional. Stanford tried to flee. He called a private jet company to book a flight to Antigua. They only accepted wire transfers. He was found 6 days later at a girlfriend's house in rural Virginia. Trial began in January 2012. The jury took 3 hours, 13 counts: wire fraud, mail fraud, conspiracy, obstruction. On June 14th, the judge sentenced him to 110 years in federal prison. His earliest possible release is the year 2103. 30,000 investors lost $7.2 billion. Less than 7% has been recovered. Antigua lost over 1,000 jobs overnight. Stanford's compound on the island sits abandoned today. Leroy King, the regulator he bribed, was extradited to the United States and sentenced to 10 years in 2021. The man who landed a helicopter carrying $20 million in cash will die in a federal prison in Texas. 3 things could have protected every single person who lost money here. First, when returns sound too good, they are. 11 to 12% guaranteed every year while the market paid 3. That gap is not an opportunity. It is the warning. Before investing in anything, ask one question: where specifically does this return come from? If the answer is vague, proprietary, or confidential, you have your answer. Walk away. Second, audit quality is not a formality. Stanford's $8 billion bank was certified by a 2-person firm on a Caribbean island. Legitimate institutions at that scale use large, independent, internationally regulated auditors with publicly available reports. Before trusting any institution with serious money, especially offshore, find out who signs the books and verify that auditor independently. If you can't find a credible audit, treat the financials as unaudited. Third, jurisdiction is part of the risk. Stanford chose Antigua because he could control the regulator. Money held offshore outside government deposit insurance is only as safe as local oversight allows. A small regulatory body in a country with no enforcement treaties is not a feature of the investment. It is the entire architecture of the fraud. Stanford ran this scheme for over 20 years. The Securities and Exchange Commission found red flags in 1997 and didn't act decisively for 12 more years. The lesson isn't just be skeptical. It's that fraud at this scale requires active, systematic effort to survive. And if you know what to look for, The evidence is almost always hiding in plain sight. The next fraud is already operating. Subscribe to Capital Sin so you recognize it before the crash, not after. And if the Stanford case felt familiar, click the video on screen. The next investigation goes even deeper.